Carl Munoz was eating dinner alone. I watched him through the front window of his row house on Amber Street, a 38-year-old schoolteacher twirling spaghetti left-handed, the table clear of a phone and the television dark. Late October in Philadelphia. The trees along the block had gone to rust but hadn't dropped their leaves. My kill window opened in 43 minutes. I'd been in the rental sedan for 2 hours, running surveillance protocols I could do half asleep. 8 years with the Temporal Corrections Bureau teaches you patience, if nothing else. 42 targets across more decades than I cared to count. Politicians, military officers, labor organizers, anyone whose continued existence in the past threatened the regime's consolidation of power. The Bureau called us erasers. We jumped to assigned coordinates in history, confirmed the target, executed, jumped back. The Bureau's causal analysts mapped every threat chain. If this person lives, this event follows, which destabilizes the regime 3 generations from now. Clean logic. Ugly execution. I flexed my left hand on the steering wheel. The ring finger had swollen at the knuckle 6 months ago. A calibration error on a jump to 1987. Chronal shearing, the medics called it. What happens when temporal displacement goes slightly wrong? Your body frays across time. In my case, localized age acceleration. The ring finger looked 60 years old. The pinky matched it. Ridged nail, thinned skin, the knuckle fat with arthritis I hadn't earned. The rest of me sat at 35. Bureau medicine couldn't reverse it. Nobody talked much about the long-term costs of the work. I pulled up Munoz's target file through my neural implant. A small device threaded into the cortex, standard issue for all erasers. It stored our original timeline memories so we could function coherently, even when the Bureau altered history around us. The implant also served as a field terminal. Mission parameters, target data, return protocols. I'd used it so often that accessing information felt like checking a wristwatch. Munoz, Carl David. Born March 15, 1986. Social studies teacher, Eastwick Middle School. Unmarried, no children. The causal justification ran 4 generations forward. Munoz's eventual grandchild would marry a woman, and their son would become a regional labor organizer in the 2080s. Someone who would contribute to a transit workers' coalition that Bureau analysts projected would destabilize federal authority in the Northeastern Corridor. 4 generations, a great-grandchild who might organize transit workers. I'd killed cleaner targets than this. Men with direct ties to resistance networks. Officers who would defect at critical junctions. Researchers whose discoveries would arm the opposition. Those causal chains were tight. The threat was real. Munoz was a schoolteacher eating spaghetti. The discomfort lodged behind my sternum. I filed it somewhere I could reach later. The window was opening. At 9:14, Munoz rinsed his plate at the kitchen sink, pulled on a blue nylon jacket, locked the front door behind him. He walked east toward the school. 4 blocks. Same route he took every Tuesday evening. The target file included his patterns going back 6 weeks. Bureau prep work was thorough, whatever else I was beginning to doubt. The alley behind Eastwick Middle was narrow, old brick on both sides, a single dumpster halfway down, no working lights. I waited at the far end. He came around the corner at 9:17, hands in his pockets, head down, thinking about whatever a man thinks about walking to a night class. He didn't see me until I was close enough to touch him. I carried a suppressed Glock 19, Bureau issued, era appropriate for 2024, untraceable. It would travel back with me when the return window activated. Nothing left behind. "What are you—" he started. 2 rounds in the chest. The suppressor cut the sound to flat cracks that echoed between the alley walls. Munoz's body jerked backward into the brick. He slid down it with his mouth open, legs folding beneath him like the bones had gone soft. His left hand grabbed at the jacket front, fingers working at the nylon, trying to find the wound or trying to hold something in. The blood came fast, spreading dark across the blue fabric, pooling beneath his thighs. He looked at me. The confusion was still there, but the fear had changed. something quieter behind it, something finished. He died looking at me. They don't always. I confirmed the kill through the implant, cessation registered, data feeding back to bureau systems, then triggered my return. The jump was smooth, bureau calibrated, no shearing. Munoz's body would be found by a janitor in the morning. A mugging gone wrong. 2024. Philadelphia had enough of those that nobody would look twice. Back at the bureau, I filed my after-action report from a terminal on the 11th floor. The hallway outside my office had rearranged since that morning. The door to the briefing room now opened onto a supply closet stacked with equipment from at least 3 different centuries. I'd opened the door, looked at a telegraph machine sitting on top of a server rack, closed the door again. Nobody commented on these things. The Bureau's headquarters existed outside normal linear time, which meant the building rearranged itself when it felt like it. You learned to check doorways. You stopped being surprised when windows showed you landscapes that had no business being there. I typed my report with 9 working fingers. The aged ring finger couldn't bend to reach the keys. The CRT monitor beside my terminal displayed a status feed from a jump bay 3 floors down. Next to it, a thought-responsive display surface showed the same data in a format that hadn't been invented yet. The building couldn't decide what decade it belonged to, neither could the technology inside it. The report was routine. Target confirmed. Method, firearm. Cleanup, none required. I submitted it to Pete Garver's queue. He was my handler, a career administrator who'd processed eraser assignments for longer than I'd been alive, as far as anyone could measure age in a building outside time. Then I sat at my desk looking at Munoz's causal justification again. 4 generations. A great-grandchild who might become adjacent to labor organizing. I'd made my peace with the work years ago by trusting the system that ordered it. Bureau analysts mapped causal chains with tools I didn't fully understand, across timelines I couldn't independently verify. Trust the analysis. Execute the assignment. That was the arrangement. But I'd spent 8 years reading target files. I knew what a solid causal chain looked like. Munoz's wasn't thin. Thin meant the analysts were stretching, making a judgment call on marginal evidence. Munoz's chain was fabricated. The difference mattered. Thin was professional disagreement. Fabricated was fraud. I decided to pull the full operational file. The institutional man's version of doubt. Quality control. Munoz's complete file was 8 pages. I accessed it through the Bureau's operational archive the next morning, from a terminal in the records wing, a section of the building where the corridors mostly stayed where they were. The windows on this floor showed flat grey. Depthless static replaced forest and skyline, making your eyes ache. The causal analysis I'd received in my briefing packet was on page 6, attributed to an analyst named Webb. But the original assessment, the first-pass analysis generated when Munoz's name entered the system, was on page 3. 0 threat. Subject has no causal significance to regime timeline stability. I'd seen the notation maybe a dozen times in 8 years, always on names that were subsequently pulled from the queue. People flagged, reviewed, cleared. It meant the analysts had examined every branch of the subject's causal tree: descendants, associations, influence, geographic impact, and found nothing. Someone had overridden the notation. The override was unsigned. The fabricated chain on page 6 had been inserted after the original assessment. I pulled the last 20 target files from my operational tier. 7 carried the same pattern. Original 0 threat notation, post hoc override, fabricated causal chain. 7 people I'd helped eliminate who had posed no threat to the regime at all. I took this to Pete Garver. His office occupied a corner of the 14th floor, where the windows showed that pine forest, old growth, heavy canopy, wind moving through branches in total silence. Whatever was out there existed in a time the glass couldn't transmit sound from. Pete sat behind a desk buried in physical folders, beside a coffee mug from a diner that hadn't existed since 1973 and a display surface he rarely touched. He was 54, thin-shouldered, with the permanently mild expression of a man who'd survived decades in a dangerous bureaucracy by never registering surprise. 7 files. I set the printouts on his desk. 0 threat originals, all of them. Causal chains inserted after the fact, unsigned overrides. Pete looked at the printouts without touching them. "Where'd you pull these?" "Operational archive. My clearance covers it." "Your clearance covers your own assignments." He said it carefully, the way he said everything, measuring each word for exposure. "Cross-referencing other tiers is a flag. Then flag me. 7 targets with no causal significance were put on the active list using fabricated justifications. I killed one of them last night." Pete leaned back. Behind him, a branch swayed in wind I couldn't hear. He picked up his coffee mug, held it without drinking. "I'll escalate this. Analyst-level review. Webb's section has been running hot for months. Could be burnout. Could be procedural drift." "It's not burnout, Pete. Take a rest rotation, 2 weeks. I'll have something by then." "Since when does a rest rotation take 2 weeks?" "Since medical started treating chronal damage as cumulative." He glanced at my left hand. "You surrender your sidearm. Report to diagnostics. Let them image the implant. Standard hold until you're cleared." The implant held the memories the Bureau's revisions could no longer reach. Every original face, every assignment as it had happened before the next correction moved the floor beneath it. Diagnostics meant giving the Bureau physical access to the only record I possessed that hadn't passed through an analyst's hands. "You want the implant? I want you off active duty while this gets reviewed." Pete set the mug down. "Don't make those the same question." He delivered the words like reassurance. His face ran a different program entirely. Pete Garver was not a brave man, but he was observant. Nothing in his expression carried surprise. He'd seen these files the way you see something you already knew was in the drawer. I left his office with my sidearm and my implant. I did not take the rest rotation. During our meeting, I'd watched Pete enter his terminal access code on the display surface, an old habit from field training, tracking inputs over a shoulder. His credentials opened 3 operational tiers above my clearance. That evening, after the corridor outside Pete's floor had rearranged itself into a configuration that put his office behind 2 locked utility doors, I used a records wing terminal to enter his code. The restricted tier held a program I'd never been briefed on, codenamed Broom. The operational summary was dense. I went through it twice because the first pass left me certain I'd misunderstood something fundamental. Broom was systematic erasure on a scale I hadn't imagined. The Bureau was engineering localized temporal paradoxes, sets of contradictions seeded into a target's causal history, to remove entire family lines from the timeline. The mechanism was different from what I did as an eraser. Instead of killing a specific individual, Broom operations created conditions in the past that made the target's existence logically impossible. The timeline resolved the contradiction by deleting the target. The deletion spread to parents, children, descendants, and everyone who depended on the same causal route. Gone as though they'd never been born. Hundreds of operations catalogued, thousands of people erased. A linked operations ledger divided the work into 2 stages. The paradox teams handled root contradiction. Erasers handled what the program called branch preparation, removing people whose continued presence might stabilize an alternate family line, preserve documentary evidence, or create another route by which the target could still enter history. The preparatory deaths were processed through ordinary assignment tiers. The field operative received a political justification. The Broom ledger received the real purpose. I searched the 7-0 threat files. All 7 came back. Munoz's mission identifier sat beside a family designation I didn't recognize, tagged branch preparation, relational redundancy. The file did not explain how a middle school teacher functioned as redundancy, or whose existence his death was meant to make easier to erase. The causal chain about a transit organizer had never been bad analysis. It had been cover. I hadn't stumbled onto Broom after killing Munoz. Killing Munoz had been part of Broom. I scrolled through the target lists. They omitted political justifications and causal chains linking erased families to resistance movements, opposition technology, or threats to regime stability. The selection criteria were classified above even Pete's tier. I couldn't determine why these families had been chosen. Ideological screening, ethnic targeting, predictive modeling, random culling. The absence of a reason was worse than any reason I could have found. Then I opened the scheduling queue. Upcoming Broom operations sorted by date, target identifiers, temporal coordinates, assigned personnel. I recognized the planning format from years of reading standard briefing packets. I scrolled through the list, page after page. My own name appeared on page 11, listed under target identifiers rather than personnel. Scott Walsh, scheduled for causal erasure, 11 days. I sat in the records wing with my aged fingers on the keyboard, looking at my name on a list of people the Bureau planned to unmake from history. 8 years of loyalty, 42 clean assignments. The loyalty had never been reciprocal. I was a tool with a shelf life. The shelf life was 11 days. The only way out of the Bureau was unauthorized temporal displacement. Authorized jumps ran through the calibration system. Bureau technicians aligned the coordinates, balanced the biological load, minimized shearing risk. Unauthorized jumps bypassed all of that. You hacked your own neural implant to accept self-generated coordinates without Bureau infrastructure. The jump would bypass calibration, leave the biological load unbalanced, and offer no safety margin. The cost was chronal shearing. Guaranteed. Worse than what a calibration error could do, because there was no calibration to begin with. I spent 4 hours in my quarters modifying the implant. The interface port sat behind my right ear, a small panel I'd never had reason to open. I worked with a field kit, a mirror, and instructions I'd reconstructed from a conversation 2 years prior. A drunk eraser named Kopek had described the rerouting procedure at a Bureau function 6 months before Kopek was reassigned to a tier no one came back from. I'd listened the way you listen to a man telling you about an emergency exit in a building you never planned to leave. Apparently, I'd listened carefully enough. I chose a destination. Philadelphia, April 2024. 6 months before I'd killed Munoz. I wanted ground truth. Whether the Broom erasures existed in the real timeline or only in Bureau files. Records could be fabricated. The world itself could not. The jump was wrong from the first instant. Authorized displacement felt like falling through cold water. Brief compression, directional pull, arrival. This was being drawn through a space that resisted me. The transit lasted too long. Something inside my chest stretched, held tension it shouldn't have been able to hold, then released at the wrong speed. I arrived in an alley 2 blocks from Munoz's row house. April in Philadelphia, warmer than October. Trees in early leaf, afternoon light cutting between buildings. The shearing hit within seconds. My left hand, already carrying 6 months of damage, seized. The muscles contracted, locked rigid. I watched the skin tighten across the back of my hand, watched the color shift to a mottled brown I associated with the hands of very old men. The knuckles swelled visibly. I could feel cartilage grinding beneath the skin, compressing, reshaping itself around joints that were accelerating through decades of wear in real time. The tendons rose through thinning tissue like cables surfacing through paper. In roughly 10 seconds, my left hand aged 30 years beyond the damage it already carried. The pain was immense. Deep bone ache radiating from every finger joint through the wrist, up the forearm. Decades of arthritis compressed into a single passage. My fingers curled into a partial fist I could not open. I pressed my hand against the alley wall, riding the wave, breathing through my nose until the acceleration leveled off. When it stabilized, I held the hand up in the April sunlight. 70 years old, minimum. The skin translucent over blue veins, The nails thick, ridged, cracked at the edges. The ring finger, which had already looked 60, had gone further. It was curled inward like a dead branch, the knuckle fused. I couldn't move it at all. The rest of me was 35. I flexed my right hand. Normal. I bent my knees. Both normal. The shearing had hit the weakest point, the area already damaged. Whether it would always target existing damage or choose randomly next time, I had no way to predict. This was the cost. I'd known it walking in. Knowing didn't make it easier to look at. The broom files had listed a family in Munoz's neighborhood. The Okafors. Father, mother, 2 sons. Address 8 blocks from the row house. Broom operation executed 14 months before my current position in the timeline. The family, according to the file, had been erased. I walked the 8 blocks with my ruined hand cradled against my ribs. The house existed. A narrow brick 2-story with a green front door, window boxes on the 2nd floor. The name on the mailbox read Patterson. I knocked. A man in his 40s answered. I asked about the Okafors, whether they'd been previous owners, whether he knew the name. Total blankness. He'd owned the house for 6 years, never heard the name. No previous owners by that name in the sale records, the title history, the neighborhood memory. His confusion was genuine. The Okafors had been removed from the timeline so completely that the space they'd occupied had sealed behind them without a seam. My implant held the broom file data. Names, ages, a photograph of 2 boys standing on this porch. Reality held a stranger who'd never heard of them. This was what erasure looked like from inside the timeline. The world simply continued as though the erased had never existed. Because from the world's perspective, they hadn't. I saw Hoffman 2 blocks later. Dale Hoffman. I recognized him from bureau personnel files, though we'd never worked together. He was walking toward me on the opposite sidewalk, wearing civilian clothes that fit 2024 perfectly. Bureau deployment. He'd tracked my unauthorized jump through its temporal signature. He crossed the street, stopped 6 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to react. Scott, time to come back. He said it the way you'd greet a colleague in a hallway. How fast did they flag the access? Garver called it in 40 minutes after you left his office. Not the restricted tier. Your pull on the cross-referenced files. You tripped a monitoring protocol. He settled his weight evenly. The restricted access came up later. That made things urgent. You've seen the broom files? I don't read operational files above my clearance, Scott. You shouldn't have either. He meant it. Hoffman was a company man the way I'd been a company man until 12 hours ago. The structure told him I was a defector, so here he stood. They're erasing entire families, Dale. Whole bloodlines. Thousands of people. No political justification for any of it. That's above both of us. My name is on the erasure list. 11 days. Something moved behind his eyes, the discomfort of a man who just received information he'd rather hand back. Whatever sympathy he felt never reached his face. He processed it. Half a second, then something in his face closed, like a door settling into its frame. I have orders to bring you in, voluntary or otherwise. I could see his weapon, a slight print at his right hip, the jacket cut for a quick draw, bureau issued, same as mine. Same training, same protocols, but his body was whole. Peak condition, bureau-calibrated jump, no shearing damage. I had a 70-year-old left hand, depleted reserves from a bad transit, and a growing certainty that I could not win this clean. How many cleaners? Just me. For now. He was telling the truth. They'd sent one because they thought one was enough. A week ago it would have been. Hoffman's right hand dropped to his hip. Clean draw, fast. I didn't try to match speed. I lunged left, threw myself between 2 parked cars, put a door panel between us. His first shot punched through the metal 6 inches from my ribs, the round deformed by the steel but still carrying enough force to crack the window behind me. I drew with my right hand. Fired twice under the sedan's chassis. aiming low. The first round sparked off asphalt. The second caught Hoffman above the left ankle. He buckled sideways, grabbing the hood of the car behind him for balance. I came around the trunk while he was still shifting weight. His weapon was up despite the leg. The man was trained, the training held, but the damaged ankle had stolen his base. He fired. The round tugged fabric at my collar, close enough that I felt the air split. I closed the distance before he could adjust, drove my right elbow into his jaw. His head snapped. He staggered backward over the curb. He grabbed at my jacket, pulled me down with him. We hit the sidewalk together. Hoffman was strong. Even with the ankle, his grip was professional, controlled, locking my weapon arm against his chest. Somewhere on the block, a dog was going wild behind a fence. I got my right forearm across his throat. He twisted, tried to roll me, couldn't plant with the bad leg. I pressed until his grip weakened, then drove my forehead into the bridge of his nose. Cartilage gave with a sound like a green stick breaking. His hands dropped, unconscious, bleeding from the nose, his left ankle wrong beneath him. I took his weapon, ejected the magazine, threw the empty pistol into a storm drain. I triggered the second jump from the sidewalk. Standing over Hoffman's body in April sunlight, residential Philadelphia, a blown-out sedan window behind me. No time to choose coordinates. I fed the implant a request for low-traffic temporal zones, anywhere the Bureau's monitoring was sparse, and let the automated selection find coordinates. The transit was worse than the first. The resistance was heavier, the duration longer, the wrongness deeper. This time the shearing hit during the jump. My right knee buckled mid-displacement, a hot implosion below the kneecap. The joint shrank. Bones shortened, compressing against muscle that expected more structure beneath it. Cartilage collapsed to something too small for my frame, too young. I felt the proportions change, the knee becoming a joint that belonged to a child while the thigh above it stayed adult. I arrived in a parking lot behind a strip mall, hit the ground immediately. My right leg folded under me, the knee too small to bear the load. I caught myself on my palms, 135, 170, and stayed there on the asphalt, breathing, cataloguing. Left hand, 70 plus. Ring finger fused. Fine motor function gone. Right knee, regressed, maybe 10 or 11 years of biological age. Too small for my adult frame. Weight bearing possible if locked straight, flexion agonizing. Everything else 35. I was becoming a collage of different ages. Each jump redrew the borders. The implant ran a field diagnostic without being asked. Coherence load unresolved. Secondary propagation possible. It was Bureau medical language stripped of comfort. Authorized calibration ended the displacement and balanced whatever temporal stress remained in the tissue. I had ended 2 jumps without balancing anything. The damaged areas might continue moving even if I never jumped again. The implant could tell me that much. It couldn't tell me which direction, which organ, or when. I pulled myself up using the bumper of a pickup truck. The knee screamed through every degree of bend, the undersized joint grinding against muscle that expected adult bone beneath it. I limped across the lot, found a bench by a bus shelter, sat. The implant told me I was in Allentown, Pennsylvania, March 2023. The strip mall sold discount furniture. Traffic passed on the 4-lane road beyond the shelter. Normal people in a timeline they didn't know was being edited around them. The Bureau would send more cleaners. They would alter the timeline to remove anyone I might contact. They would erase me in 11 days if I held still long enough. I had a place. Ridgecrest Federal Research Complex, New Mexico. A date range, September 2041. A project name I'd caught in the Broom files. Origin. A lead researcher, Paul Castor. The Bureau's founding event, the first successful demonstration of temporal displacement, had happened at Ridgecrest. If I could reach it, if I could destroy the equipment or prevent the demonstration, the causal chain that created the Bureau would collapse. The Bureau I knew would lose its origin, and Broom's planned erasures might disappear with it. The specific date was redacted. The nature of the experiment was classified. I was missing the details that mattered most, the ones that would tell me exactly what to destroy. I needed the Bureau's backup archive, a physical records cache I'd seen referenced in the Broom files, a rented storage facility maintained in Omaha, Nebraska, in 2039. A fail-safe in case the Bureau's systems outside time ever suffered a catastrophic failure. If the founding event's unredacted details existed anywhere outside the Bureau's central network, they'd be in that storage unit. I tested my right knee. It held weight if I kept it locked straight. Bending was something I'd have to negotiate. I started walking. The jump to Omaha cost me a section of my upper back, third unauthorized displacement. I'd aimed for the storage facility's neighborhood, industrial district, west side of the city, 2039, and arrived on a loading dock behind a warehouse row. Cold March morning. Nobody in sight. Each transit was harder than the last. The resistance inside my body was thickening, as though some margin of biological coherence was narrowing with every displacement. I landed on concrete, caught myself with my right hand, waited for the shearing. It hit between my shoulder blades. What I mistook for muscle cramp became something else. A loosening. A separation. The skin pulled away from the tissue beneath it, the way old adhesive lifts from a surface it can no longer grip. I felt the patch spread across my upper back, maybe 8 inches wide, the skin aging decades in the time it took me to straighten up. Unable to see the damage, I reached over my shoulder and touched tissue that felt thin as damp paper, fragile enough that pressing too hard might tear it. I stood on the loading dock, cataloguing. Left hand, 70 plus, ring finger fused, no fine motor. Right knee, regressed to pre-adolescence, weight bearing only when locked. Upper back, aged patch, structural fragility. Everything else, 35. The functional inventory was shrinking. The storage facility was 4 blocks north. Rental units behind a chain-link fence, padlocked. The implant confirmed the unit number from the Broom files, 17. I broke the padlock with a tire iron from a maintenance shed. Nobody came to investigate. Inside, filing boxes. Dozens of them sat on metal shelving, labeled with Bureau project codes. I pulled boxes until I found the ones labeled Origin. 3 boxes, personnel files, equipment manifests, facility blueprints for the Ridgecrest Federal Research Complex. Paul Castor's name appeared on everything. Chief researcher, project director, the man who'd made temporal displacement work. But the core data I needed had been stripped. Every page covering the specific date, the nature of the apparatus, the exact sequence of the demonstration was either missing or blacked out with heavy redaction bars. Someone had sanitized the physical archive the same way they'd sanitized the digital records. Thoroughly, with the paranoid completeness of people who understood what they were protecting. I had September. I had Ridgecrest. I had Castor. I did not have the day. One restriction had survived the redactions, Origin Exclusion Protocol. No authorized Bureau displacement could arrive within 36 hours before the first successful Origin transit, or 12 hours after it. The note described the problem as reciprocal causation. A system could not safely insert its own personnel close enough to alter the event that created the system. Every Bureau jump array hard-locked coordinates inside that interval. The protocol allowed one final pre-window deployment, launching it sealed every earlier coordinate that could feed a later team or instructions across the boundary. Attempts to override the lock risked collapsing the deployment packet before arrival. It was the kind of rule field personnel memorized without ever being told what event had made it necessary. I had known the exclusion existed. I had never known its center. If I reached Ridgecrest early enough, the Bureau could follow me until the window closed. After that, the founding event itself would stand between us. For 36 hours, the institution that had erased families would be unable to enter the only place where I could prevent it from being born. I could jump to September 2041 and search on the ground, but every jump was costing me more of my body, and I was running out of parts I could afford to lose. Before I left the storage unit, I tried to contact Ray Loomis. Ray was had been a fellow eraser, assuming the Bureau hadn't already reassigned or retired him. We'd trained together during my first year and shared a dormitory floor in the Bureau's residential wing. We spent more evenings than I could count at a bar called Sheehan's, which existed in some version of 2022 the Bureau kept accessible for staff recreation. Ray dealt cards left-handed, drank bourbon with ice, talked too much after his third glass, which was when the real opinions surfaced, the doubts he kept buttoned up during working hours. He was the closest thing I had to a friend inside the institution, or outside it for that matter. The work didn't leave room for many connections beyond the people who did the same work. Ray had also been the only person I'd ever heard voice doubt about the Bureau's direction. Late one night at Sheehan's, 4 bourbons in, he told me he'd seen things in the operational tiers that didn't sit right. He hadn't elaborated. I hadn't pressed. That was how you survived at the Bureau. You heard things, you filed them, you didn't follow up unless you were forced to. I was forced to. I used the implant to locate Ray's personal timeline coordinates. His home address in the original timeline, the one the implant preserved regardless of what the Bureau altered, an apartment in Baltimore, 2025. Second floor walk-up above a dry cleaners on Eastern Avenue. The implant returned a void where data should have been. The address existed. The street existed. Ray Loomis did not. Every trace was gone. Biographical record, Bureau personnel file, timeline signature. The implant held my memories of the man, sharp, specific, vivid, but could not locate anything in the current timeline that corresponded to him. I could see Ray at the corner table at Sheehan's, shuffling cards with his left hand, ice shifting in his glass. His voice came with the picture. The slight rasp, the way he dropped consonants when he was tired. The last conversation we'd had before I left on the Munoz assignment came back too. Ray complaining about a misaligned return protocol that had given him headaches for 2 days. Mundane, ordinary. The kind of detail you don't bother to invent. The world had never heard of him. The Bureau had erased Ray Loomis from the timeline. The same process the Broom files described. The same technology that had removed the Okafor family from their Philadelphia row house applied to a Bureau operative. To my friend. They'd erased him because he was someone I might contact for help. The strike was strategic. Cut the defector's support before he can reach for it. I checked my brother next. Kevin Walsh, 3 years younger, an HVAC technician for a commercial contractor in Dayton, Ohio. Or he had been. The implant held 29 years of shared history. At 12, Kevin threw a tennis ball against the garage door until the neighbors complained. At 22, he helped me load boxes into a rental truck. Last year, he sat across from me at a diner booth in Dayton, telling me about a furnace installation that had gone sideways. His wife had just had their second kid. He'd showed me a photo on his phone. The implant searched. Kevin's apartment in Dayton belonged to someone named Markovich. His employer had no record of him. The diner existed. The booth where we'd sat existed. Kevin Walsh did not. I sat in the storage unit surrounded by filing boxes from a program that had erased thousands of people, holding memories of a brother and a friend that the world insisted had never been born. The implant preserved the memories, held them vivid, while reality held the gaps. The distance between the two was growing. It was like standing on a floor that had lost half its joists. The surface held weight, but the support beneath it was gone, and every step tested whether the next board would give. Every hour I stayed still, the Bureau removed more. My past was being dismantled piece by piece. The implant's insistence on preserving what had been taken was becoming its own kind of damage. I carried memories with no foundation in the real world. The question of whether the implant was protecting my mind or poisoning it was one I didn't have time to sit with. I had Ridgecrest, September, and Castor. The date would have to come from the ground. I jumped. Fourth unauthorized displacement. Ridgecrest Federal Research Complex, New Mexico, September 2041. The shearing was the worst yet. It hit in 3 places during transit. My right eye, something spreading across the lens, grey, granular, collapsing the clarity to a washed-out blur. Depth perception on that side was gone. A lower left molar loosened during the displacement, worked free of the gum with a grinding release I felt through my entire jaw. I spat it into my palm when I arrived, a healthy tooth shed by bone that had aged past the point of holding it. A patch of my left forearm, 4 inches below the elbow, regressed instead of aging. The skin smoothed and lost its hair. It turned soft and pink, an infant's skin on an adult arm, absurdly delicate against the hair surrounding it. I arrived in a dry wash a mile east of the complex perimeter. High desert, late summer heat. I lay in the sandy bottom of the wash, taking inventory through one clear eye while the other gave me grey shapes without edges. My body was a catalogue of wrong ages now. 70-year-old hand, child's knee, aged back, infant forearm, clouded eye, missing tooth. 35 everywhere the shearing hadn't reached, but the exceptions were gaining ground. Ridgecrest spread across the desert floor in concrete, chain-link military vehicles parked along the perimeter road. A federal research campus built for function. Low buildings, wide lots, armed guards at the main gate. This was before the Bureau existed, before temporal displacement was anything but a theoretical curiosity for a small team of government-funded physicists. My operational credentials, my training, my implant, none of it carried institutional weight here. I was a damaged intruder with no identification, trying to infiltrate a secured facility with whatever skills my failing body could still execute. I spent 2 days outside the fence, mapped guard rotations through my good eye, identified the main laboratory building at the campus center, heavier security, constant equipment deliveries through a north side loading bay. Found Paul Caster on the second morning, a thin, grey-haired man in his 50s, walking between the lab building and a residential block with a leather briefcase, absorbed in whatever calculations he was running behind his eyes. Security waved him through the checkpoints without glancing at his badge. A man so embedded in the facility that verifying his presence was like verifying that the buildings were still standing. I needed the specific date. I couldn't get it from outside the fence. On the third morning, I found a junior researcher at a gas station 2 miles down the access road. He was filling a government sedan, staff badge clipped to his shirt pocket. Young, maybe 26, with the eager carriage of someone early in a career he found thrilling. I asked if he worked at the complex. He did. I told him I was writing about federal research funding in New Mexico for a regional paper. Cover thin enough to collapse under any real scrutiny, but I only needed it to hold for 3 minutes. Big things happening out there. Can't really discuss specifics. He said it with the pleasure of a man who desperately wanted to discuss specifics. I heard the department push Caster's demonstration to the 23rd. His attention came off the pump. Who told you that? A budget office in Santa Fe. They're working from the old visit schedule. The correction escaped before he remembered he wasn't supposed to make one. The 19th, 5 days out. Department officials, military observers, the whole works. September 19th? He looked at my face, checking how much he'd already given away. Pride won. Dr. Caster's been practically living at the lab. He told me more than he should have. The names of visiting officials, the security upgrades, the supplemental generators that had been trucked in to handle the energy requirements. I supplied 2 more wrong details and let him correct both. I listened, committed the answers to the implant's shrinking reliable storage, thanked him. September 19th. 5 days. I retreated to the ridgeline east of the complex. I had the date. I had the location. I had 5 days to survive with a body that was running out of functional territory. On the evening of September 17th, the cleaners found me. I'd moved my position to a shallow wash on the complex's south side, scouting approach routes for the 19th, when movement registered to my left. Two figures on the ridgeline I'd used on day one, 70 meters out. They moved with the spaced, angle-covering discipline of field operatives. Hoffman. Even at 70 meters, even through one working eye, I recognized the square build, the forward weight. His left ankle was braced. I'd put a round through it in Philadelphia. He was compensating well. The Bureau had patched him, recalibrated his jump, sent him back out. The second figure was younger, leaner, moving like a man who hadn't been recently shot. Another eraser repurposed for internal enforcement. They'd decided one wasn't enough. The origin exclusion would close around Ridgecrest before midnight. They had arrived at the edge of it, as late as the Bureau could safely send them. This wasn't another sweep in an open timeline. If I could survive these two and force their return, no replacement team could reach the demonstration. I crawled backward through the wash, keeping below the rim. The sandy floor scraped the aged patch on my back. I felt something there give, a small, tearing sensation, tissue separating along the weakened skin. I kept moving. The wash curved south for 40 meters before opening into a rocky drainage channel with low stone walls on both sides. I followed it on my forearms, dragging the bad knee. I set up behind the channel's west wall, drew the Glock with my right hand, set it on a flat rock at chest height where I could fire over the wall without standing. Hoffman came down into the wash first, found the impression my body had left in the sand. Followed it south, weapon up, checking the wash ahead. The braced ankle slowed him without stopping him. The second cleaner came down 30 seconds later, paralleling the wash from the ridge above, covering Hoffman from elevation. Standard two-man sweep pattern. I'd run it myself a dozen times in training. I shot the man on the ridge first, 2 rounds through a gap in the channel wall. At 30 meters with one working eye, the first round caught him in the hip. He spun. The second hit him in the chest as he turned. He went down behind the ridgeline. No sound after the fall. Hoffman reacted before my second round had finished traveling, already diving for the wash wall, putting stone between us. He came up firing. 3 shots hit the rock above my position, spraying fragments. A chip opened a cut above my clouded right eye. Blood ran into the blur, turning grey to red. I dropped below the wall. Hoffman was moving, gravel shifting under his feet, the slight drag of the bad ankle, circling, working for an angle. I shifted right, came up on the opposite side of the drainage channel. He was closer than I expected. 15 meters, crouched behind a rock shelf, weapon braced on stone. We fired at the same time. His round hit me in the left shoulder, a punch of heat that swung my entire left side backward. My round caught him in the right forearm. His weapon fell. My left arm went heavy. The shoulder wound combined with the 70-year-old hand turned the entire left side into dead weight. Hoffman was clutching his forearm, blood running between his fingers, but he was still upright, still moving. He charged. 15 meters, covered fast despite the ankle. I fired right-handed. The round went high, the shoulder impact throwing off my platform. He hit me at the waist. We went down together into the gravel. My back struck a rock. The aged skin tore. I felt it split along the weakened patch, a wet parting of tissue that had no business absorbing impact. Hoffman got an arm around my throat. I drove my right knee, the regressed joint, the child-sized bone, into his braced ankle. The sound he made was raw, involuntary, nothing like a trained operative. His grip broke. I got free, got the Glock up, right hand, shoulder screaming through every movement that involved the left side of my torso, and pressed the muzzle against his chest. "Stay down, Dale!" He looked up at me through eyes bright with pain. His forearm was bleeding badly. The ankle was done. He stayed. I climbed to my feet. Reaching the ridge meant using my right hand on stone and keeping the bad knee straight while the wounded shoulder dragged at my balance. The younger cleaner lay on his back where the slope had stopped him. Young face, mid-20s, the chest round had entered above the sternum. Blood rose once at the corner of his mouth when I put 2 fingers beneath his jaw, then no more. His implant showed no viable pulse, and a paired return packet keyed to Hoffman. Bureau policy brought its dead home when it could. Bodies, implants, issued weapons, nothing that identified the Bureau left for local investigators. I'd killed 43 people for the Bureau. This was the first I'd killed against it. The difference mattered in what I did next. I went back down to Hoffman. How long on the exclusion? He kept his hand pressed over the forearm wound. You read more than the target lists. How long? His eyes shifted toward the west, measuring light. 23 minutes. Trigger the paired return. If I go back, they know you're here. They already know. In 23 minutes, knowing stops helping them. He understood the full plan then. Ridgecrest, the date, and the reason I'd stayed close to a facility the Bureau could surround but would soon be unable to enter. You don't know what happens if you break the origin, he said. Neither do they. That's why the decision isn't ours. I pressed the Glock against his vest. Return packet, both signatures. Hoffman used his good hand to open the implant control behind his ear. A status tone sounded from his jacket and from the dead cleaner on the ridge. Blue-white distortion gathered around both bodies, flattening their outlines as the return system acquired them. Before it took him, Hoffman pulled a field dressing from his belt and dropped it in the gravel between us. I couldn't tell whether the gesture was mercy or professional acknowledgement. Maybe he didn't want the man who might erase his employer to bleed out 2 days early. You're coming apart, he said. The return took him before I answered. The ridge above me emptied at the same instant. Their blood stayed dark in the gravel, mixed with chipped stone and the tracks we'd cut into the wash. The packet took the operatives, their implants, and the issued equipment still on them. It did not revise the ground. I sealed the shoulder as well as one hand allowed. The dressing tightened automatically, hard pressure biting into the wound. Then the shearing hit without a jump. It came from inside, unresolved coherence load finding a threshold my body couldn't hold. My left ear went first. The hearing simply stopped, replaced by a pressurized silence on that side. The loss was instant and complete. One instant I could hear the wind, the gravel settling under my boots, the distant generator at the complex. The next instant, the left side of my world went quiet. I staggered. Equilibrium depends on both ears. Half my input had just vanished. I caught myself on the channel wall, waited for the vertigo to settle into something I could walk through. The origin window closed 20 minutes later, while I dragged myself toward a corrugated maintenance shed at the complex's outer perimeter. I locked the door, sat on a bag of dry concrete mix, took inventory. Left hand, useless. Left shoulder, gunshot wound, limited mobility. Right knee, weight bearing only locked straight. Left ear, gone. Right eye, clouded. Upper back, torn skin, missing molar. Infant patch on left forearm. Right hand, right eye, right ear, still functional, still mine. The implant was degrading. The hardware held, but the memories it preserved were developing something I could only call softness. Kevin's face was crisp when I focused on it, but the color of his eyes kept shifting. Brown, green, something between. I'd known my brother's eye color for 29 years. The datum was no longer stable, as though the timeline's corrections were reaching into the implant itself, dissolving the edges of what I'd been allowed to keep. September 19th was 2 days away. I woke in the shed before dawn on the 19th. Getting upright required leverage from my good arm against a shelf that held rakes. The first thing I did was check my arms. I'd written on them the night before. My right hand handled the left side. For the right forearm and hand, I'd clenched the permanent marker between my teeth. I used every patch of skin flat enough to hold ink. Notes to myself, in case the implant's reliability collapsed overnight. The infant smooth patch on my left forearm held the most important words, vivid black against pink skin. Paul Caster, Ridgecrest Lab, Destroy Equipment, September 19th. My right forearm, Broom, Bureau erases families. You are scheduled. Origin is the founding event. The back of my right hand, you were an eraser. 8 years. Remember why you're here. The back of my left hand cramped across the aged knuckles in writing barely legible even to me. Kevin. Ray. The notes were insurance. The implant surfaced memories in bursts now. Clear, vivid, then gone, replaced by gaps that felt like reaching for a shelf that someone had removed while I wasn't looking. I remembered Ray's voice. Then I couldn't remember his face. Then I remembered perfectly. The narrow jaw, the squint when he was thinking, and the clarity itself felt suspect. Was the implant reporting or inventing? I had no way to check. I'd woken with context. I knew who I was, what I'd come to do. The details held as long as I didn't test them too hard. A broken tooth feels solid until you bite down. The plan was simple because nothing complex was available to me. Walk into the laboratory. Destroy the temporal displacement apparatus before the demonstration could run. Destroy whatever test records I could reach. Make this morning fail. That did not guarantee the Bureau would never exist. Caster knew what he'd built. If he lived, he might rebuild it in a month or a year or 10 years. But Bureau operations were indexed to the successful demonstration as their causal origin. Move the origin and every assignment founded on this date lost its fixed relationship to history. Some target lines would change. Some would never enter the queue. A delay bought time for people who had none. I could have made the result more permanent by killing Caster. His file would have been easy to write. Paul Caster, future creator of Temporal Corrections Bureau. Direct causal threat. The tightest justification I'd ever seen. It was also the Bureau's logic in its purest form. Kill a man now because of what other people might build from his continued life. I had trusted that sentence 42 times. Munoz had died inside it. The equipment was the target. The demonstration was the target. Caster would live if I could leave him alive. That distinction was all I had left. The 19th was busy at Ridgecrest. Government sedans streamed through the main gate from 7 onward. Military transport, a communications van, staff vehicles. The demonstration was the biggest event in the complex's history. Attention focused inward, toward the lab, the preparations, the arriving officials. Perimeter security had actually thinned. Guards had been pulled to interior checkpoints to manage VIP access. I left the shed at 8:40, crossed open ground toward the laboratory building's north side, the loading bay where I'd watched equipment deliveries for days. My pace was slow. The knee demanded it. I wore the same work clothes I'd used since day 3, sweat-stained, sun-bleached, dusty. At a distance, I passed for a maintenance worker. Up close, I looked like a man who belonged in a hospital. Nobody stopped me. The loading bay was open. 2 technicians ran cables from a supplemental generator. They didn't look up as I passed into the corridor that led toward the main laboratory space. Voices ahead. The sound of equipment cycling up. The density of too many important people in a confined room. I followed it. The laboratory door was propped open. I stopped beside it, pressed my right shoulder against the wall, looked in. The apparatus occupied the center of the room. A complex assembly of metal framing, cable bundles, vacuum chambers, power regulation units, components I couldn't name, but recognized from Bureau historical materials the implant still held, or claimed to hold. The Omaha blueprints gave me 3 usable targets. The displacement core sat inside a ribbed housing at the center of the frame. A regulation manifold fed it from the left, glass pressure tubes arranged in a row above braided power cable. 10 feet behind the apparatus, a control bank held recording drives and the live test sequence. Paper notebooks lay open on a steel cart beside it. Destroying the core would stop the demonstration. Destroying the controls and notebooks might lengthen whatever came after. The recognition might have been real. It might have been the implant filling gaps with manufactured certainty. I couldn't tell anymore. It mattered only long enough to choose where the rounds went. Paul Castor stood between the core and the control bank, speaking with two uniformed officers. His hands moved as he talked, mapping something technical in the air. Around the room's perimeter, observers sat in folding chairs, military officials, intelligence personnel, civilians in dark suits. Maybe 25 people waiting to witness what they'd been told would reshape the country's strategic position. Castor was 6 steps from me. The core was 9. The control bank was 12. I walked through the door. A uniformed colonel near the entrance turned first, silver eagles on his shoulders. He saw a limping man in filthy work clothes with mismatched skin, a clouded eye, blood dried on his collar from the shoulder wound. His expression cycled through confusion into alarm. I brought the Glock up. Castor turned toward the movement. For 1 second the line was clear. Center chest, 6 steps, no cover. The easiest shot in the room. I shifted past him and shot the apparatus. The Glock held 9 rounds. I fired into the targets the Omaha plans had given me. The first round pierced the displacement core housing. Something inside ruptured with a sound like a pressure vessel failing, a sharp crack followed by a sustained hiss of escaping gas. The second shattered the manifold's glass tubes, spraying fragments and pale vapor across the lab floor. The third hit the cable junction. Current arced along the frame in a white sheet and fire ran into the bundled insulation. The room broke apart. Observers dove from their chairs. The colonel drew a sidearm. A technician threw himself behind a console. Castor remained upright, staring at the core as if the failure were something he could still solve by looking hard enough. I spent the 4th and 5th rounds on the control bank. 1 drive housing burst out of the console. The second round hit lower, where the test sequence relays met the power bus. The bank flashed. The technician recoiled behind the console. Paper lifted from the cart in the pressure wash, notebooks opening and closing across the floor. Castor moved toward them. I put the 6th round through the cart's lower shelf. A metal canister ruptured. Solvent spread beneath the papers and reached the burning insulation in a low blue sheet. A staffer tackled Castor away as the notebooks curled black at the edges. The colonel fired. His first round struck the steel frame. I dropped behind the apparatus, the bad knee folding too slowly, and the ricochet cut a line across the side of my neck. I let the Glock fall and tore a fire extinguisher from the wall mount with my right hand. Its weight pulled across my chest into the wounded left shoulder. I hugged the cylinder to my ribs, reached the open core housing, and drove its base into the buckled panel. The impact folded metal inward. I braced the extinguisher on the frame and slid it higher, sparing myself a full swing. Then I dropped my weight through my good side and struck again. Components crushed. Glass broke deeper in the assembly. Something inside the housing made a descending whine, held a high note, then stopped, the sound of a system losing the energy it needed to exist. I jammed the extinguisher neck first into the opening, then hauled it sideways. Braided cable tightened around the cylinder, turning it into a lever between the core and the frame. The colonel shot me. Right shoulder. The round hit bone that had been aging beneath the visible patches since the shearing started. A deeper, slower degradation I hadn't detected. The bone didn't resist the way 35-year-old bone should have. It shattered, brittle material giving way under ballistic force like dried chalk. The impact spun me into the apparatus. My back hit the frame. The torn skin on my upper back split further. I felt blood, warm, immediate, run down my spine. I didn't fall. The apparatus held me up. The extinguisher was still wedged in the core, its handle level with my ruined left hand. I couldn't raise either arm. I hooked the fused fingers of my left hand through the extinguisher handle. They couldn't close, but the joints held. I laid my left forearm across the cylinder, trapped it between my ribs and the frame, and let the undersized right knee give way. My falling weight drove the extinguisher down. The cylinder twisted inside the housing. Cables snapped one after another, sharp reports beneath the alarms. The core tore loose from its mounts and dropped against the lower frame. Something broke at a level deeper than the components, the sound of a foundation giving. Then the sound changed. The sound changed inside me. The implant destabilized. All at once, as though a keystone had been pulled from an arch I'd built my adult life inside. Memories flooded in contradictions, operational files severed from their origin, coordinates for a building whose reason for existing had vanished. 8 years of stored data, kills, briefings, jump records, faces, collapsed into noise. The implant was trying to preserve a history that was ceasing to have happened. The Bureau's causal chain was breaking while temporal displacement remained possible. Castor was alive. The notebooks would not all burn. But the successful demonstration every Bureau operation used as its origin had failed in front of the people meant to authorize it. The institution founded on this morning had lost its place in history. The shearing hit without limit. My left hand went first. The skin, already 70 years old, continued forward. The moisture left it in seconds. The knuckles drew inward as tendons shrank to wire. The skin cracked along the finger joints, split, and began to separate at the edges. A dry, fine dissolution of cells that had been driven past the end of their biological timeline. The hand was dying of old age in real time. I watched it happen. I couldn't stop watching. My right knee swung the opposite direction. It regressed further, bones shortening, softening, the kneecap shrinking to something that belonged on a small child. The joint lost coherence entirely. My leg folded. I went down beside the ruined apparatus, one hand crumbling as the child-sized knee softened beyond use. The infant patch on my left forearm aged forward. The pink skin wrinkled, browned, sagged. The notes I'd written there, Paul Castor, Ridgecrest Lab, Destroy Equipment, stretched as the skin beneath them changed shape. The words distorted into marks I couldn't read. Then the skin began to crack the way my hand was cracking, drying, separating. My right eye, already clouded, went dark. The grey film thickened to opacity in one instant. My good eye, the left, started to fog at the edges, the clear centre narrowing like a closing aperture. People were shouting. I heard them from my right ear only, muffled, the way sounds carry through deep water. Someone pressed hands against my shoulder wound. Someone pulled me away from the frame. Their touch registered differently on each patch of skin. Normal sensation on the 35-year-old sections, nothing on the aged zones, sharp pain on the infant-smooth areas where nerve endings sat too close to the surface. I looked at my arms. The notes were gone, transformed by the skin's acceleration into illegible smears of ink on tissue that no longer held its original shape. The left hand I was looking at was barely a hand. The fingers had fused into a curled mass of dried tissue, the nails buried, the wrist narrowing as muscle atrophied in real time. My right hand was different, too small. The fingers short, soft, the skin smooth. A child's hand on an adult forearm. It flexed once, reflex, not choice, then went still. The last thing that held was a face. I didn't know the name that went with it. The implant had emptied, or I could no longer reach what it contained. The face belonged to a man at a table seen through a window, eating dinner alone. Brown eyes, left-handed, a blue jacket on the back of his chair. I didn't know why this face was the one my collapsing mind refused to release. I just saw him, a man eating alone, ordinary, alive in a memory that belonged to no one now. Then the face went too. The laboratory, the morning after, broken equipment on the floor, scorch marks on the ceiling tiles from the junction fire the sprinklers had caught. The body had been moved to the complex infirmary. Medical staff could not explain what they were looking at. A single human body whose tissues showed wildly incompatible biological ages. The left hand desiccated, consistent with extreme old age, while the right hand matched a child of 4 or 5. A knee joint of early childhood proportions attached to adult musculature. Skin samples from different sections of the torso spanning an estimated 60-year developmental range. One kidney appeared functional. The other had atrophied past use. The body's identity was a blank. Searches of federal, state, and military databases found no fingerprint or dental match. The man did not appear to exist in any system, any record, any history. The medical examiner's preliminary report cited systemic organ failure of unknown origin. The word impossible appeared 3 times in his notes. Paul Castor spent the morning surveying the damage to his apparatus. The displacement core was destroyed. The vacuum chambers were shattered. The power regulation systems were burned beyond salvage. He told the military observers it could be rebuilt. He estimated 14 months. The demonstration was postponed. The officials returned to Washington. The military escorts departed. Castor began ordering replacement components. The rebuilt apparatus worked 14 months later. By then, changed oversight and thousands of ordinary decisions separated the failed demonstration from the successful one. The institution eventually created from origin called itself the Temporal Corrections Bureau, but it did not inherit the same operational history. The first year Broom Q Scott had seen belonged to a bureau founded on a morning that no longer contained a successful transit. During those 14 months, 612 people scheduled for erasure in the bureau's original first operational year went on with their lives. They raised children. They worked. Their altered branches never entered the replacement queue. They became permanent fixtures in a timeline that carried no record of the threat they had been marked to face. They would never know. Nobody would.